Did you know that France once spent $9 billion on a fortification that failed in 6 weeks? And that Spain is still trying to build a megaproject that was started in 1883. But there's more. While Europe has completed some of the world's most complex megaprojects, the continent is also home to some colossal failures. From mega airports that failed to attract any passengers, to abandoned capitals that could have changed the face of Europe. These are 12 of Europe's biggest abandoned megaprojects. By the end of World War I, France had lost nearly 1.4 million soldiers. Entire generations had been fed into the trenches of the Western Front and never came back. Whole regions of the country had been shelled into rubble. When the war finally ended, one question dominated French military thinking above all others. How do we make sure this never happens again? Their answer was concrete, enormous, extraordinary amounts of it. Under direction of André Maginot, France's Minister of War, France was to build the most sophisticated fortification system ever conceived along the entire German border. Construction of the Maginot Line began in 1929. What his engineers built along the Franco-German border over the following decade was genuinely staggering. 45 major fortress complexes, nearly 100 smaller forts, hundreds of reinforced bunkers, and over 100 kilometers of underground tunnels connecting them all. The tunnels contained electric railways, hospitals, air conditioning systems, ammunition depots, and living quarters for thousands of soldiers. The concrete walls were thick enough to absorb direct hits from the heaviest artillery in the world. The whole thing cost around 3 billion French francs, roughly equivalent to $9 billion today, and took 11 years to complete. The Maginot Line that stretched nearly 450 kilometers from Switzerland to the Belgian border was arguably the most sophisticated defensive fortification ever built. However, it had one critical gap. France did not extend the fortifications along the Belgian border because Belgium was an ally, and fortifying that border would imply France expected Belgium to fall. The Ardennes forest on the Belgian-French border was considered impassable to modern armies, so it was lightly defended. The Maginot Line covered the direct German border, but left the Belgian approach protected mainly by treaties and optimism. On May 10, 1940, France's worst fears came true. Germany invaded not through the 450-kilometer fortifications, but through Belgium. They bypassed the Maginot Line entirely and broke through the complicated terrain of the Ardennes forest. German tanks raced through the forest, crossed into France north of the fortifications, and drove toward Paris. The massive forts along the German border sat fully manned and ready to fight, but the war was happening 100 kilometers away. The Maginot Line itself was never breached. The soldiers manning its forts fought on, some holding out even after France had fallen. The fortifications did exactly what they were built to do. They just couldn't compensate for a military doctrine that hadn't reckoned with how completely the nature of warfare had changed since 1918. France fell in 6 weeks. The Maginot Line sat intact, irrelevant behind the battle. Much of it still exists today. Sections have been opened as museums, where visitors can walk the underground tunnels and stand at the gun emplacements that were never fired in the direction that mattered. It remains the largest surviving artifact of the Second World War, a structure so well built that it has outlasted nearly everything around it, a reminder that you can construct something perfectly and still have it fail completely, simply because you built it to fight the last war instead of the next one. The Maginot Line wasn't abandoned in the traditional sense, it just became obsolete before it was ever used. From France's static defenses that were bypassed, we cross over to Germany and to a billion-dollar convention center that was never finished. In the divided Berlin of the 1970s, everything was political. The wall had been standing for over a decade, cutting the city in two, and on each side the same silent competition played out in concrete and steel, each government trying to demonstrate through its buildings that its way of life was the one worth choosing. By the 1960s, the West wanted to demonstrate its progress, modernity, and global relevance. To turn that vision into reality, Germany decided to build the largest convention center in Europe. It was named the Internationales Congress Centrum, the ICC. and remains one of the most extraordinary buildings in Germany. Designed by the husband and wife architectural team of Ralf Schuler and Ursulina Schuler-Witte, who won the commission as relative unknowns in 1966, the building would look like nothing else in Berlin. It would stretch 320 meters along a motorway and was clad entirely in brushed aluminum that catches the light like the hull of a spacecraft. Berliners immediately started calling it the spaceship, and the nickname stuck. Inside, it could accommodate over 20,000 people across 80 conference rooms, with a main auditorium holding 5,000 people. The building was to reinforce West Berlin's identity as a vibrant, forward-looking city despite its isolation deep inside East Germany. Construction began in 1973 on a site near the western edge of West Berlin and was completed by 1979. The project was extraordinarily expensive, over 1 billion Deutsche Marks, which made it one of the most costly buildings in Germany at the time. The city justified this by projecting that the ICC would host hundreds of conferences annually, generating tourism revenue and establishing Berlin as a hub for international gatherings. And for a while, it delivered. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the ICC was the premier congress venue in Europe, drawing international conferences, trade shows, and political summits. It won design awards, appeared in films, and hosted some of the most notable dignitaries in the world. That, as it turned out, was the beginning of the end. Reunification changed everything about Berlin's position in the world. West Berlin had been a showcase, a statement, a city that needed to prove itself precisely because of its extraordinary circumstances. Once Germany was reunified and the political point no longer needed making, the ICC's reason for existing became much harder to justify. The building was enormous, expensive to run, and increasingly out of step with what modern conference organizers needed. The room layout was inflexible. The technology was aging. Rivals in Frankfurt and Hamburg were newer and more efficient. The ICC kept operating, but it kept losing money too. Then in 2014, the building was closed for asbestos contamination requiring removal. However, once the doors closed, they never reopened. Since then, Berlin has been trying to figure out what to do with it. Demolition isn't really an option. The cost of removing the remaining asbestos and tearing down a reinforced concrete building of this scale would be staggering. In late 2024, the city launched a formal competition for private investors to submit proposals for its future use, with a 99-year lease on offer. A consortium was selected in 2025 and is currently developing plans focused on art, culture, and innovation. Whether any of that actually happens remains to be seen. The ICC has been waiting for its second act for over a decade, a billion-euro spaceship grounded on a West Berlin motorway. Still extraordinary, still stubbornly there, a building that outlasted the ideology that built it and is still searching for a reason to exist in the world that replaced it. From Berlin's conference center that outlived its purpose, we go back further to an even grander vision for reshaping the city. At some point in the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler planned a new capital for his 1,000-year Reich. He envisioned a monumental city of granite and marble that would dwarf every other capital on Earth. He called this vision Germania, and he tasked his architect Albert Speer with making it real. This was Germania, Hitler's plan to tear apart one of Europe's great cities and rebuild it as the eternal capital of a 1,000-year empire. The man tasked with making it real was Albert Speer, appointed in 1937 as General Building Inspector for Berlin, and given powers that bypassed every government agency and municipal authority in the city. Speer and Hitler had been working on the vision for years, and the scale of what they planned was genuinely staggering. Berlin would be reorganized around a 5-kilometer north-south boulevard, with entire neighborhoods demolished to make room for government buildings, museums, and monuments. The centerpiece was the Volkshalle, the People's Hall. Hitler had sketched the original idea himself in 1925, inspired by the Roman Pantheon. The finished design called for a dome 250 meters wide and 290 meters tall, with an interior large enough to hold 180,000 people. The estimated cost for the hall alone was around 1 billion Reichsmarks. The human cost was considered irrelevant. Residents would be relocated, and concentration camp labor would do much of the construction work. Some preliminary work actually began. The Grand Boulevard was partially cleared, with buildings demolished and residents forcibly moved. The Great Hall's foundation was tested by building a massive concrete cylinder that was sunk into the ground to measure how far it would settle. The cylinder sunk 19 centimeters, showing that the arch could never have been built without enormous ground stabilization work first. The empire's architectural ambitions were, quite literally, too heavy for the earth beneath them. Some elements of Germania were actually completed, but the bigger buildings, the Volkshalle and the Grand Plaza, never left the models. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, construction was suspended pending victory, a victory that never came. Allied bombing devastated Berlin, destroying many of the completed buildings and making the grand plans increasingly absurd as Germany faced defeat. The rubble of bombed buildings created ironic parallels to the demolition that was supposed to make room for Germania. Berlin was being cleared, just not in the way Hitler envisioned. The Great Hall was never built. The triumphal arch remained a concept. The Grand Boulevard was partially cleared, but never completed. Most of what Germania would have become existed only in Speer's drawings and Hitler's imagination. The Germania project was quietly shelved for good. The concrete cylinder is still there today, standing in a quiet corner of Tempelhof, slowly sinking into the ground it was built to test. It has been a listed monument since 1995, the most tangible remnant of a project whose ambition was matched only by the catastrophe required to stop it. From Hitler's architectural nightmares in Berlin, we move east to Stalin's equally megalomaniacal vision for Moscow. Joseph Stalin looked at the Moscow skyline in 1931 and decided it needed something that would prove Soviet superiority over the capitalist world. His plan was the Palace of the Soviets, a building he had been envisioning for a decade. It was to be the largest building in the world. The site Stalin chose for this monument carried symbolic weight. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior, Moscow's largest Orthodox church, would be demolished to make room. The design that was eventually selected by architect Boris Island called for a tiered neoclassical tower rising 415 meters into the Moscow sky, taller than the Empire State Building, which had just been completed in New York. At its very top, a 100-meter statue of Lenin would stand with his arm raised, visible from miles across the city. The total height, statue included, would have made it the tallest structure on Earth. The interior Grand Hall would seat over 20,000 people. There was one problem nobody wanted to say out loud. Moscow's ground is soft. River sediments, groundwater, unstable soil that shifts and floods. Engineers drilled test boreholes and began excavating the foundations. The Moskva River kept seeping in. Drainage systems were installed. More pumping, more concrete. The deeper they dug, the more water they found. Construction of the steel frame began in 1937 and a small portion was erected, enough for Soviet newspapers to run triumphant photographs of the project underway. But adequate funding never materialized. The technical challenges kept multiplying. And then in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Construction stopped immediately. Workers were diverted into military service. The steel frame that had been erected was dismantled and melted down, used to build bridges needed for the war effort. Where the Cathedral of Christ the Savior had once stood, and where the greatest building in the world was supposed to rise, there was now just an enormous flooded hole in the ground. It stayed that way for years. After the war, Stalin briefly revived talk of resuming construction, but the Soviet Union had more pressing problems: rebuilding entire cities, developing nuclear weapons, feeding its population. The Palace of the Soviets quietly disappeared from official plans. Under Khrushchev in 1958, the decision was made to do something practical with the hole, and it was converted into an open-air heated swimming pool, the largest in the world naturally, because the Soviet Union was still in the business of building the world's largest things. Muscovites swam there through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, in the exact spot where Stalin had blown up a cathedral to build a monument to Lenin that was never built. Then, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the story took one final unexpected turn. In 1990, before the USSR had even formally dissolved, the Russian Orthodox Church received permission to rebuild the Cathedral of Christ the Savior on its original site. The swimming pool was drained and demolished in 1994. Donations poured in from across Russia and from the diaspora abroad. 6 years later, in 2000, the rebuilt cathedral was consecrated, an almost exact replica of the one Stalin had dynamited 7 decades earlier, standing on the same riverbank, looking out over the same city. The Palace of the Soviets was supposed to replace a cathedral with a monument to the permanence of communism. Instead, it left a hole in the ground for 60 years, and the cathedral came back. While one cathedral is back in Europe, we move to another, one that has been in the making for 3 centuries and may finally become a reality. Barcelona is home to a building that, despite being one of the most visited landmarks on Earth, is still not finished. The Sagrada Familia has been under construction since 1882, even before the Eiffel Tower, and the story of why it remains unfinished is one of the strangest in architectural history. Barcelona, in the late 19th century, was in the middle of a cultural and political awakening, and one man deeply inspired by this movement was Antoni Gaudí, an architect who did not think in straight lines. He was behind the iconic designs for buildings like Casa Mila and Casa Batlló Gaudí. However, as a devout Catholic, Gaudí wanted to build something that would stand as the spiritual heart of Catalonia. His idea was a cathedral set in stone for the ages. Gaudí threw out the original neo-Gothic plans, separated from the traditional architecture, and started over. What he designed was unlike anything in the world: massive spires that looked like melting sandcastles, each dedicated to an apostle, the evangelists, the Virgin Mary, and at the center, the Tower of Jesus Christ, rising 172 meters above the city. Facades covered in stone that seemed to grow organically, like a forest frozen in time. The interior flooded with colored light from stained glass windows that Gaudí calculated to shift with the sun throughout the day. It wasn't just a church, it was a statement that architecture could be as alive as nature itself. Gaudí knew from the start he'd never see his ambition come to life. The scale was too vast, the detail too ahead of its time. But Gaudí wasn't just philosophically resigned to this, he was practically prepared for it. He spent years creating extraordinarily detailed plaster models and geometric calculations, essentially writing an instruction manual for whoever would have to carry on after him. Then, in June 1926, 3 blocks from the construction site he had dedicated his life to, Gaudí was struck by a tram. He died 3 days later. He was 73, had been living in a workshop on site for years, and had given away most of his personal wealth to the project. At the time of his death, only the crypt, the apse, and one facade stood complete. Construction slowed to almost nothing, and then, a decade later, it got dramatically worse. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, anarchist militants broke into the site and burned Gaudí's workshop to the ground. His plaster models, structural drawings, and calculations, everything future builders needed to understand his intentions, were destroyed. What had been a slow project suddenly had no roadmap at all. For years after the war, there was a genuine debate about whether to continue. Respected architects argued the building should be left unfinished as a monument to Gaudí rather than risk distorting his vision with guesswork. And they had a point. Anything built from that moment forward would be interpretation, not restoration. Construction crept forward anyway through the 1950s and 60s, funded by nothing more glamorous than donation boxes and tourist ticket sales, with progress so slow it was barely visible. What finally broke the deadlock was the advent of computers. In the 1990s, architects started to digitally reconstruct Gaudí's destroyed plans by studying the geometry of what had already been built, reverse engineering his intentions from the stone itself. Suddenly, there was a real roadmap. Finally, in 2019, 137 years after the first stone was laid, the city of Barcelona issued the building's official construction permit. It had technically been illegal the entire time. The sound of cranes and construction workers started bringing Gaudí's vision to life. Today, the Tower of Jesus Christ is rising above the Barcelona skyline, and completion is expected within this decade. When it's done, It will have taken longer to build than any structure in human history, not because anyone gave up on it, but because one man's vision was so complex, so specific, and so far beyond the technology of his time that the world simply needed a century and a half to catch up. While Gaudi's dream seems to be turning into reality, we go to London, where a building born out of a tea giddy could have become Europe's tallest skyscraper. In April 1992, a bomb went off in the heart of the City of London. It was planted by the IRA, and the blast was so powerful it shattered windows across the financial district, killed 3 people, and left one of London's most historic buildings, the Baltic Exchange, completely beyond repair. The site sat as a bombed-out shell for years, a scar right in the middle of one of the world's most important financial centers. Someone was going to build something there eventually. What nobody expected was just how ambitious that something would turn out to be. In September 1996, developer Trafalgar House unveiled plans for what they were calling the London Millennium Tower. They had hired Norman Foster, arguably Britain's most celebrated architect, and what he came back with was genuinely staggering. A 386-meter glass tower with 92 floors, offices, apartments, a hotel, and a public viewing platform 300 meters above the London skyline. At the time, it would have been the tallest building in Europe and the 6th tallest in the world, behind only the Petronas Towers, the Sears Tower, and the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The estimated cost was around $550 million, roughly $1 billion in today's money. The design itself was unlike anything proposed for London before. Most skyscrapers tapered toward the top. This one didn't. It maintained its full width for almost its entire height, a massive glass monolith that would have been visible from virtually everywhere in the city. Foster's team nicknamed it the erotic Gherkin, a name that immediately spread through the press and stuck around far longer than the project itself. For a brief moment, there was genuine excitement. London in the mid-1990s was reinventing itself. The financial sector was booming, the city felt ambitious, and having the tallest tower in Europe felt like a statement worth making. The project had early support from English Heritage, which was itself surprising given the building's sheer scale. But almost immediately, the opposition started stacking up. English Heritage reversed their position once they fully absorbed what 386 meters would actually look like against the London skyline. Their concern was St. Paul's Cathedral, Wren's masterpiece that had dominated the city's skyline for 3 centuries. The Millennium Tower wouldn't just compete with St. Paul's, it would reduce it to a footnote. The Royal Fine Art Commission called the design an over-assertive and intrusive presence, which, for a government body, is fairly close to calling something an eyesore. Then came the issue that effectively ended the whole conversation: Heathrow Airport. The tower's height would have put it directly in the flight paths of aircraft approaching one of the world's busiest airports. That wasn't a planning objection. That was a hard technical constraint with no obvious workaround. You can't negotiate a flight path. By 1997, the project was effectively dead, killed by a combination of aviation restrictions, heritage concerns, and a planning environment that simply wasn't ready for a building of that scale in that location. Not a single foundation was dug. The money spent amounted to design and planning fees. Significant, but nowhere near what would have been lost had construction actually begun. The story has an interesting twist, though. The site didn't stay empty. Trafalgar House sold it to Swiss Re, the Swiss insurance giant, who approached the same architect, Norman Foster, with a much more modest brief. What Foster designed this time was a 180-meter, 41-floor tower with a tapered, bullet-shaped profile that would famously become known as the Gherkin. The name had been coined for the Millennium Tower, but it fit the new building so perfectly that it just transferred over. The Gherkin opened in 2004 and is now one of the most recognizable buildings in London. So the site that started with a bomb almost became Europe's tallest tower and ended up with one of the city's most beloved landmarks. Speaking of beloved landmarks, we moved to a remote German town where a $4 billion megaproject was repurposed to something entirely opposite. A few kilometers from the Dutch border lies the small German town of Kalkar that is home to an impressive amusement park. Roller coasters, a Ferris wheel, go-kart tracks, a 437-room hotel, And at the center of it all, a giant cooling tower with a swing ride built inside it. Families drive from all over Europe to visit. However, almost none of them fully appreciate what they're actually standing in. A $4 billion nuclear power plant that was completed, fully built, and never switched on even once. The story starts in 1972, when West Germany had a problem. The country was heavily dependent on energy imports, and with global oil prices spiraling out of control after the 1973 oil crisis, the government was desperate to find a way to generate power domestically. Nuclear energy was the obvious answer, and Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands jointly commissioned the construction of a fast breeder reactor near Kalkar, a cutting-edge design that could theoretically generate more fuel than it consumed, running on plutonium. It was genuinely revolutionary technology, and the three governments were convinced they were building the future. Construction began in 1972, and the trouble started almost immediately. A fast breeder reactor is extraordinarily complex. It's cooled by liquid sodium, which reacts violently with both air and water, meaning every single system has to be engineered to a level of precision well beyond a conventional nuclear plant. Every delay triggered a redesign, and every redesign triggered another delay. What was supposed to be a straightforward project dragged on for over a decade, and costs that began at a few $100 million Deutsche Mark ballooned to $7 billion, roughly $4 billion, enough to have built 20,000 family homes. Meanwhile, the public was growing increasingly nervous. In 1977, 5 years into construction, around 40,000 protesters marched through the streets of Kalkar. Then in 1979, 3 Mile Island happened, a partial meltdown at a nuclear plant in Pennsylvania that terrified the world and brought anti-nuclear sentiment in Germany to a fever pitch. Construction was halted for 4 years while safety commissions reviewed the entire design. More upgrades, more costs, more delays. By 1985, the plant was finally complete. The sodium coolant was already running through the system, kept hot at enormous expense so it wouldn't solidify in the pipes. The reactor was fully ready to receive nuclear fuel. And then, 1 year later, Chernobyl happened. The explosion at the Soviet reactor in April 1986 changed everything. The images of evacuation convoys, contaminated farmland, and a city abandoned overnight hit Europe with the force of a shockwave. Germany, which had already been uneasy about nuclear power, turned decisively against it. The state government of North Rhine-Westphalia, which had authority over nuclear licensing, refused to issue the operating permit. The federal government, with elections approaching, chose not to push the issue. The plant sat there, fully built, fully functional in every technical sense, costing over 5 million euros per month just to maintain in standby mode, and going absolutely nowhere. For 6 years, it just sat there. The sodium kept being heated. The maintenance crews kept showing up. The bills kept coming. Finally, in 1991, the project was officially canceled. The valuable components stripped out and sold off, and the site put up for auction. It sold for 2.5 million euros, a fraction of a percent of what it had cost to build. The man who bought it was a Dutch entrepreneur named Henny van der Most, and his plan for the site was the opposite of what it was originally meant for. He turned it into an amusement park. The reactor building became a hotel. The cooling tower, that great hulking concrete monument to a power plant that never generated a single watt, was painted to look like a snowy mountain and fitted with a swing ride inside. The park opened in 2001 under the name Wonderland Kalkar and now draws around 600,000 visitors every year. There's something almost poetic about it. Germany spent $4 billion, 13 years, and enormous political capital building a machine designed to power a nation. And what it ended up powering was a merry-go-round. From Germany's abandoned nuclear plant in a remote town, we moved to a Greek village which could have been the location for the continent's tallest dam. In the village of Mesochora, high in the mountains of central Greece, there's a cafe with a red line painted on its wall. Next to the line, someone has written the number 785. That's the altitude in meters, the point at which the water would rise if the dam just outside the village were ever filled. The cafe sits below that line. So does the post office, the church, and about a third of the houses in the village. For nearly 40 years, the people of Mesochora have been living under the threat of being swallowed by a reservoir that still hasn't arrived. And the dam causing all of this? It's been sitting there, fully built, for over 2 decades, and not a single drop of water has ever been held behind it. The idea behind the project goes back to the 1930s, when Greek engineers first looked at the Achelous River, the second longest in the country, and saw potential. The river ran through the mountains of western Greece, carrying enormous volumes of water all the way to the Ionian Sea. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pindus mountain range, the vast agricultural plains of Thessaly were chronically short of water, relying on shrinking groundwater supplies to irrigate their cotton and wheat fields. The solution seemed obvious: divert the Achelous through a tunnel under the mountains and redirect its water eastward to Thessaly. Build a series of dams, generate hydroelectric power along the way, and solve 2 problems at once. The Greek government revived the idea in 1984, and construction began at Mesochora 2 years later. The dam itself was an enormous undertaking, 150 meters tall, built into the steep walls of a mountain gorge, with enough capacity to power a 162-megawatt hydroelectric plant. But almost from the beginning, the project ran into resistance. Local residents, who had never been properly consulted, suddenly discovered that 2/3 of their village would be submerged once the reservoir filled. Environmental groups pointed out that diverting the Achelous would devastate the river's delta on the Ionian coast, a protected wetland home to flamingos, pelicans, sea eagles, and over 30,000 animal species. And Greece's own Supreme Court kept intervening, repeatedly freezing construction after ruling that the environmental impact studies were inadequate. Work stalled, restarted, stalled again. By 2001, the dam structure itself was technically complete, but the reservoir had never been filled, the power plant had never been commissioned, and the legal battles showed no signs of ending. The government tried bypassing the courts with new legislation in 2006, only to face fresh challenges from the European Court of Justice. By 2010, work had stopped again. The dam just sat there in the gorge, enormous and useless, slowly developing cracks in its wall before it had ever held a drop of water. Meanwhile, the village of Mesochora existed in a kind of suspended limbo. Families had been living for years with compulsory purchase orders hanging over their homes, not knowing whether to invest in their properties or prepare to leave. Many simply left anyway, not waiting to find out. A village that once had a full community gradually hollowed out, its population dwindling as younger generations moved to the cities, rather than wait indefinitely for a future that kept getting postponed. On the wall of the town hall, someone hung a sign that read, "Mesochora will live." It was hard to know whether it was defiance or a question. The total cost of the project by this point had exceeded 300 million euros, worth closer to 500 million in today's money, and all of it spent on a structure that had generated not a single watt of electricity. Then, at the end of 2025, something shifted. The Greek government designated the Mesochora plant a project of national economic importance and signed a new agreement with the state power company to finally complete it. Studies for relocating the remaining residents were commissioned, with the government promising full compensation for all affected households. For the first time in decades, there appeared to be genuine political will to end the stalemate. Whether that actually happens remains to be seen. The Mesochora Dam has been almost finished, almost cancelled, almost revived so many times that the people living in its shadow have long since stopped trusting announcements. The red line on the cafe wall is still there, and so is the cafe for now. Next up, we have a different kind of Greek village that once brought the country immense prestige but couldn't sustain its legacy. When Athens won the right to host the 2004 Summer Olympics, it felt like a homecoming. The modern Olympic Games had been born in Athens in 1896, and 108 years later, the world's greatest sporting event was returning to where it all started. Greece threw itself into the preparations with enormous national pride and enormous amounts of money. What followed was one of the most celebrated Olympics in recent memory and one of the most catastrophic sporting legacies in history. The scale of construction was staggering. Greece built or completely renovated 37 competition venues across the city, including a main Olympic stadium with an iconic glass and steel roof designed by Santiago Calatrava. There was an aquatic center, a velodrome, a beach volleyball arena on the coast, stadiums for hockey, baseball and softball, and an Olympic village large enough to house 16,000 athletes. Alongside the venues, the city built a new international airport, expanded the metro system, laid new tram lines, and constructed a ring motorway around the city. The official cost, according to the Greek Finance Ministry, came to $9 billion. Some economists put the real figure closer to $14 billion. The preparations were a nightmare. Of the 7 years Greece had been given to get ready, 4 were largely swallowed up by planning changes, personnel reshuffles, legal disputes, and what later became the subject of corruption trials over inflated construction contracts. With just weeks to go before the opening ceremony, several venues were still unfinished. Workers were pulling double and overnight shifts to get things done in time. At least 14 people died during the construction process. The main stadium was completed just 2 months before the games opened. And then the Olympics happened, and for 2 weeks, it was genuinely magnificent. Athens delivered a spectacular event, warm, dramatic, deeply felt. The opening ceremony was widely praised. The athletics were thrilling. The city buzzed. For Greece, it was a moment of immense national pride, and the world watched. Then the flame went out, and reality set in. The Greek government had spent billions building world-class facilities, but had made almost no concrete plans for what to do with them afterward. The softball stadium stood empty because nobody in Greece played softball. The hockey center never hosted another match after the closing ceremony. The velodrome and aquatic center were locked and left to deteriorate. Weeds pushed through the stands. Graffiti spread across the walls. The beach volleyball arena on the Athens coast, once packed with 10,000 cheering spectators, became one of the most photographed symbols of post-Olympic decay in the world, a rusting skeleton sitting beside the sea. When Greece's debt crisis exploded in 2010, the abandoned venues shifted from an embarrassment to something more serious. The country was being asked to accept brutal austerity measures while billions of euros worth of sports facilities sat rotting in the sun. The IOC's own chairman at the time estimated that the Games may have contributed 2 to 3% of Greece's catastrophic external debt. Greek athletes, meanwhile, were training abroad because the facilities at home had become too dangerous to use. Some equipment was so outdated that coaches feared it would cause injuries. The company set up to manage the Olympic properties, Hellenic Olympic properties, struggled for years to attract investors. The Olympic Village, built to house thousands of athletes, gradually became a ghost town on the outskirts of the city. Slowly, some venues found second lives. The shooting center became a police training facility. A taekwondo hall was converted into a theater. The aquatic center eventually reopened, and the large Hellenico coastal complex has been earmarked for a major private redevelopment project with plans for a park, residential buildings, and a casino. Some of the abandoned stadiums there have already been demolished to make way for it. It's now 20 years since the Athens Olympics. The infrastructure built for the Games, the airport, the metro, the motorways, still serves the city every day. But the sporting venues tell a different story. What happens when a country spends everything it has on a 2-week party and then wakes up the morning after? Speaking of parties, we go to a European ghost town that was once the continent's biggest tourist destination. In the early 1970s, Varosha, a beachfront district on the eastern coast of Cyprus, had become one of the most sought-after destinations in Europe. The hotels were modern, the beaches were spectacular, and the whole place hummed with the energy of a resort at the height of its powers. In 1974, it was the #1 tourist destination in Cyprus, and investment was still pouring in. New hotels were under construction. The future looked bright. Then, on the morning of August 14, 1974, the Turkish military advanced on Famagusta. What happened next has its roots in decades of tension between the Greek and Turkish communities in Cyprus. The island had been a powder keg for years, and when a Greek military-backed coup tried to force the unification of Cyprus with Greece, Turkey sent 40,000 troops to the island, citing its right to protect the Turkish Cypriot minority. Within days, Turkish forces had taken control of roughly a third of the island. As they approached Famagusta, the Greek Cypriot residents of Varosha grabbed what they could carry and fled south, fully expecting to return in a few days once things calmed down. Many left their front doors unlocked. Cars sat in driveways. Shops had stock on the shelves. Building sites still had scaffolding up. However, they never came back. The Turkish military fenced off the entire district, strung barbed wire around its perimeter, and declared it a closed military zone. Their calculation was strategic. Varosha was too valuable to simply hand back. It would serve as a bargaining chip, something to trade in future peace negotiations in exchange for political concessions. So the fence went up, the gates closed, and an entire functioning resort town was simply left to stand empty and decay. For the next 50 years, nature slowly took over. Weeds pushed up through the roads. The hotels that had once hosted European celebrities stood silent, their facades crumbling, their pools dry, their lobbies filled with the debris of decades. The grand buildings that had once been symbols of Mediterranean glamour became some of the most haunting images of abandoned architecture in the world. All of it sitting behind a wire fence, untouched, just a few hundred meters from ordinary daily life in Famagusta. The United Nations repeatedly called for Varosha to be returned to its inhabitants. UN Security Council Resolution 550 explicitly stated that settling any part of it by people other than its original residents was inadmissible. Peace negotiations came and went. The Annan Plan of 2004 would have returned Varosha to Greek Cypriot control, but it was rejected in a referendum. The bargaining chip remained exactly where it had been, behind the wire, getting older and more decrepit with every passing year. Then, in 2020, the government of Northern Cyprus announced a partial reopening of Varosha. A small section of the beachfront was open to visitors. Turkey's President Erdogan visited in person to mark the occasion. For the original residents, many of them now elderly, some of them having spent 50 years dreaming of going home, the partial reopening felt less like progress and more like a door being quietly closed forever. Walking through the reopened streets today, you can still see the war damage from 1974 on the sides of buildings. Signs warn visitors to stay back from structures that could collapse at any moment. The hotels are beyond saving. Most of what was there in 1974 is now too far gone to restore. Varosha spent 50 years as a ghost town, not because of financial failure or engineering problems or political indifference, but because two sides in a conflict each decided it was more useful as a pawn than as a home. From ghost towns, we move on to ghost airports and take a closer look at the world's biggest abandoned airport. In the region of Castilla-La Mancha in central Spain lies an airport with the longest runway in Europe, 4,200 meters of pristine tarmac, wide enough to handle the largest commercial aircraft in the world. There's a full terminal building, a control tower, hangars, taxiways, and a pedestrian bridge leading to a high-speed railway connection. It cost over €1 billion to build, and in the 3 years it was actually open as an airport, it handled fewer passengers than a mid-sized provincial bus station. It eventually went bankrupt and was put up for auction. A Chinese investment group submitted the winning bid of €10,000. This is the story of how Spain built one of the great infrastructure follies of the 21st century. The idea was born in the late 1990s, when Spain's economy was booming. The country had adopted the euro. Interest rates were low, credit was flowing freely, and a wave of infrastructure investment was sweeping across the country. New motorways, high-speed railways, stadiums, convention centers. Madrid's main airport, Barajas, was genuinely overcrowded. The idea of a second major airport serving the capital region wasn't crazy. The chosen location was Ciudad Real, about 200 kilometers south of Madrid. The airport megaproject would have a high-speed rail link added to better serve the capital. Construction began in 2002, and the problem started almost immediately. The site sat inside a protected bird habitat and inside a dormant volcanic field, which the EU flagged as an environmental concern. Construction was halted while new assessments were carried out, delaying the opening by 4 years. By the time those delays were resolved and the airport was finally nearing completion, something significant had changed. Madrid's Barajas airport had undergone a massive expansion, doubling its capacity to 70 million passengers a year. The original problem the Ciudad Real airport was built to solve had quietly solved itself. Every airline that had been vaguely considering Ciudad Real now simply flew from Madrid instead. The airport finally opened in 2009 with a terminal designed for 10 million passengers a year. Its runway could handle an Airbus A380 and had been built to be a major international hub. However, only 2 airlines ever operated there, Ryanair and Vueling, and one of them required government subsidies to do so. That's because the airport just did not make any sense for visitors. An expanded Barajas had enough capacity for Spain's tourism industry, and it didn't lie 200 kilometers from the capital. In its best year, 2010, the airport handled around 33,000 passengers in total. Barajas was handling that many people every few hours. The high-speed rail station that was supposed to make the airport accessible was never built. Only the bridge connecting the terminal to the empty field where the station was supposed to be was ever completed. By 2012, just 3 years after opening, the airport operator filed for bankruptcy with debts of over 300 million euros. The gates closed, the check-in desks went dark, and the terminal began its transformation into one of the most eerily photogenic abandoned buildings in Spain. The runway sat empty. The control tower fell silent. The main regional savings bank that had funded much of the project collapsed shortly afterward, becoming the first Spanish bank to require a government bailout during the financial crisis. When the bankruptcy auction was held, the starting price was set at 100 million euros. Nobody bid. It was reduced to 28 million. Still, nobody bid. Eventually, a Chinese-led consortium called Zanin International submitted the only offer, 10,000 euros, and the Spanish courts, somewhat understandably, rejected it as insulting. The airport finally sold in 2018 for 56 million euros, about 5% of what it had cost to build. The pandemic gave the airport a lease of life. It served as an aircraft storage facility for grounded planes from airlines including Virgin Atlantic and Cathay Pacific. Film crews have used it as a location. Jean-Claude Van Damme once did his famous splits between 2 moving trucks on the deserted tarmac for a Volvo commercial. In 2024, the Spanish government briefly floated the idea of converting it into a migrant reception center, but local opposition quickly killed that plan too. So for now, Ciudad Real Airport remains exactly what it has been for most of its existence, a billion-euro monument to the gap between a very confident plan and a very uncomfortable reality. Europe does not have a shortage of confident plans that could not bridge the gap with reality. However, none of them come close to what Britain wanted to build to replace one of the world's biggest airports. London has a problem that has been annoying planners, politicians, and airline executives for the better part of a century. Its main airport, Heathrow, is in completely the wrong place. It sits to the west of the city, which means aircraft on approach have to fly low directly over millions of people's homes. It's hemmed in by suburbs on all sides, making expansion a political nightmare. It operates at nearly full capacity, with 2 runways handling more flights than almost any other airport in the world. And the obvious solution, build a new hub airport somewhere less constrained, has been proposed, studied, debated, shelved, resurrected, and killed again so many times that it has become one of the great recurring dramas of British public life. The idea of putting an airport in the Thames estuary to the east of London goes back to the 1940s. The logic was always the same. The estuary is relatively unpopulated. It's close enough to the city to be practical, and building over water avoids the problem of displacing tens of thousands of residents. However, many versions of the idea came and went over the decades, always colliding with the same environmental concerns, costs, and the immense political difficulty of shutting down Heathrow and the enormous economic ecosystem built around it. In 2008, Boris Johnson, then Mayor of London, picked the idea back up and ran with it harder than anyone before him. Johnson's vision wasn't just for a new runway or 2. It was for an entirely new 4-runway hub airport built on an artificial island in the estuary, capable of handling 150 million passengers a year. It would replace Heathrow entirely. The new airport would be connected to central London by high-speed rail in under 30 minutes, with links north to the rest of the country and south through the Channel Tunnel to Europe. The press quickly dubbed it Boris Island, and the name stuck. Johnson spent the next 6 years promoting the idea with characteristic enthusiasm, commissioning studies, hiring architects, and making the case publicly at every opportunity. By 2013, the scheme had been developed into a detailed proposal costing an estimated £47 billion just for the airport itself, with a further £25 billion or more needed for road and rail connections. The total bill, depending on which version of the plan you looked at, ran anywhere between £70 billion and £100 billion. For context, that's more than the entire annual NHS budget. The problems were stacking up even as Johnson kept pushing. In September 2014, the government's Independent Airports Commission delivered its verdict. It rejected Boris Island entirely, concluding that the project had substantial disadvantages that collectively outweigh its potential benefits. The economic disruption of closing Heathrow would be enormous. The environmental hurdles might prove impossible to overcome. Potentially £60 billion in government funding alone was simply too large to justify when cheaper options existed. Meanwhile, the estuary remains empty of airports, the birds continue their migration, and the idea of Boris Island has joined the long list of grand British infrastructure proposals that made perfect sense on paper and proved utterly impossible in practice. Which these megaprojects could have been successful, and is there a future for any of them? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, check out our compilation of the biggest abandoned megaprojects in China. Keep following SIGNUM, and we will see you in the next video.